Well, good afternoon, Judge Riley, and thank you for doing this on behalf of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. We're very appreciative that you're willing to take the time to give us a bit about your history.
And thank you for the opportunity and the interest in even hearing anything from me.
We're very interested. Today is June 23rd, I think, 2017, and we're in the chambers of the former Chief Judge, soon to be Senior Judge, and soon to be retired, as I understand it.
That's correct.
All right. Well, the first thing I would like to do is start with some basic details and try to get them out of the way. And I'm going to kind of do a cross of you. I just want yes or no answers, okay? It's true, is it not, that you were born in 1947 in Lincoln, Nebraska and grew up there?
I did, yes.
You graduated from the University of Nebraska with Phi Beta Kappa.
Yes.
In history.
No, in political science, history, and English minors.
Oh, I'm sorry. You went to law school at the University of Nebraska, where you were elected a member of the Order of the Coif, and you were editor-in-chief of the Law Review. Is that true?
Yes, it is.
You then became a clerk for Eighth Circuit Judge Donald Blay.
Yes.
He encouraged you to become a trial lawyer.
He did.
And he recommended to the Fitzgerald firm, one of the preeminent litigation firms in Omaha, Nebraska, that they hire you.
Yes, he did.
And then they did.
That's right.
And one of your partners was our beloved Senior District Judge Lyle Strong.
That's correct.
You became chief of the litigation group there.
Eventually, yes.
Various trial-related organizations have honored you as a trial lawyer. The National Board of Trial Advocacy certified you as a civil trial specialist.
Yes.
The American College of Trial Lawyers made you a fellow.
That's correct.
And you became state committee chair of the college.
Yes.
American Board of Trial Advocates made you a member, and you served as the state chapter president. Is that true?
That's true.
During this period of time and thereafter, you served as an adjunct professor at both the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and at Creighton Law Schools.
That's right.
You taught trial advocacy?
I did.
All right. Well, let me see here. Oh, you were active in the Nebraska Bar Association.
Yes.
You were very active in the Boy Scouts of America. Is that right?
That's true.
You were a Scoutmaster for a decade.
That's correct.
You were a member of the Board of Trustees of the Mid-America Council of the Boy Scouts.
That's right.
Let's see, what else can we find here? You became a United States Circuit Judge on August 3rd, 2001.
Correct. Sworn in August 16th.
But your
The commission says August 3rd.
And you became Chief Judge in 2010 and served until, I think, March of 2017.
That's correct. April 1st, I was the April Fool's Chief Judge.
So far as I know, you are the only Nebraska Circuit Judge ever to have been the subject of a Senate concurrent resolution in the state of Arkansas. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you whether it's accurate. It says, commending Judge William J. Riley of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals for his contribution to the legal profession. Whereas Judge Riley was appointed by President George W. Bush to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals and took his oath of office August 16, 2001. And whereas Judge Riley is a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the Nebraska Law School, whereas Judge Riley was the editor-in-chief of the Nebraska Law Review and clerked for the Honorable Donald P. Lay of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. Whereas before his appointment to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Riley was a civil trial lawyer with Fitzgerald, Shore, Bartmittler, and Brennan in Omaha, Nebraska. Whereas former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court William Rehnquist appointed and current Chief Justice John G. Roberts reappointed Judge Riley to serve on the United States Judicial Conference Committee on Criminal Law. Whereas in 2001, Judge Riley was listed in the best lawyers in America and more recently listed as one of the leading 500 judges in America by Law Dragon. Whereas Judge Riley's countless accomplishments and honors throughout his legal career are representative of his high standing in the legal profession and his impact on the practice of law. Now therefore, be it resolved by the Senate of the 87th General Assembly, the House of Representatives concurring therein, that the General Assembly commends Judge William J. Riley for his outstanding achievements and his contribution to the legal profession. Have I accurately read that, Judge?
To the best of my recollection, and how in the world did you ever find that?
And that was in 2009, Judge. I want to turn to something that judges never read, or they say they never read. It's called the Almanac of the Federal Judiciary. They ask lawyers about judges, and here's part, at least, of the lawyer's evaluation of you in the most recent edition. Lawyers interviewed said Riley is a bright and capable judge. He is intelligent, prepared, and a fair judge. He's a very smart guy. He was very, very thorough. I could tell he read every case we cited. It was impressive how he retained the case law. He is very much in control and very much in charge. In my opinion, he is one of the best on the bench. He is a very able judge. I don't think there's any question about his intellectual ability. I describe him as fair and honest. I think he's very capable. The Almanac goes on to say the lawyers said about you that you were even-tempered and polite, that you do ask your share of questions about the case, that you're very pleasant, that your courtroom demeanor is good, you're very cordial and professional and polite. He's the perfect judge. He is a gentleman, an experienced trial judge, and before that, an A-list civil litigator. He is civil and cordial in how he treats lawyers. He's very respectful and polite. He is very pleasant and very courteous. So that's what the lawyers think of you. Do you think that's accurate?
It's just the way I wrote it.
All right. Now I want to go back to your childhood. Now that we've got some of your accomplishments out of the way, and we'll go back to some of those in a moment. Tell me about your childhood.
Well, I was an only child, which my wife Norma explains that says that explains a lot of my problems. And I was raised in Lincoln at a great time to be raised in Lincoln, and I enjoyed music. I enjoyed sports. What a lot of people don't know is that, well, back up a minute, my mother was a concert pianist and she was somewhat of a savant as a young person. And I was such a disappointment to her because I was not. And she tried to teach me piano, but I couldn't accomplish anything like she did. So she said I could not give up music. So I had to find another instrument. And so I took up the trumpet. And I did, and I played in the trumpet I played trumpet in junior high, and then in high school in the orchestra. Was lead first chair and so forth. I was in the youth symphony, in a dance band. I loved it, and that was my music side. And then in sports, I played football and basketball and baseball, but I burned out on baseball, although it was probably my best sport. Somewhere there I found time to study and do things in school. And I was not early on a quick reader. They pulled kids out of my class and said that they're going to have a special reading class for these smart kids, and I was not one of them. And I took that as a challenge, and I said, well, if I'll show them that I'll end up being a better reader than they are. And that was back in elementary school. So I'd say my young life was very happy and enjoyable to me, but I learned to be very competitive. And I didn't know then that, that's good if you want to be a trial lawyer, and it's good for life. But I really, any time that my father would tell me something, you can't do that. And he knew that if he said that, that I was going to try to prove him wrong. And so I'd say that school and sports and music were really what guided my life for those, through high school anyway.
You took some of those attributes and mentored first-time offenders, isn't that right?
I did. I was in, one of the most enjoyable things I did was in a Boy Scout, it was a Boy Scout organized juvenile diversion program. And they worked with the juvenile courts in Omaha. And they would take first-time offenders, and I would have a group of, I don't remember, maybe 12 or 15 kids from about 13 to 17. And would work with them. We would meet on Wednesday night and had various programs. The Scouts would organize with speakers or events, we'd go somewhere. And one of the last ones was to go to the Nebraska Penitentiary over here by the airport and do a Scared Straight deal, and I did that. And I remember so much about those kids. I remember I had girls 13 years old who were pregnant, and I had boys that were, just on the verge of going the wrong direction. And I had one man, young boy, who was 15 or 16 from North Omaha, who had been accepted to Creighton Prep. And then he got into trouble, and Prep said, if you get convicted of this, you will not come to Prep. And so he had to get through it. And he was going to Prep really because he was a basketball player. So I had told him at the beginning that if he was past the diversion program, I was going to take him out on the church yard there, and I was going to whoop him in basketball. And at the end, I thought maybe he'd forgotten it, but in the end, he passed, and he got his degree, or his graduation, and he brought his basketball that last night, and he said, "Come on, let's go." And we went out in the parking lot, and he cleaned my clock playing basketball. But anyway, those were quite enjoyable, and it was just like the Boy Scouts. Working with young men there was, and I've said, those 10 years, as you said, a decade as Scoutmaster, were the most enjoyable years of my life, working with those young boys.
Your partner and our beloved senior Judge Lau Strong was heavily involved in the Boy Scouts as well. Mm-hmm. Did you ever go on any hiking trips with him? We
went on a leadership one time. he probably will deny this, but I was in scouting before he was, and I'm the one that said, you know, this is great, you know, you ought to get into it. And of course, he got in with both feet and went on for many, many years. But we were out in a leadership camp out at Camp Eagle near Fremont, and we were there for a couple nights, and they were all getting ready to go to bed the first night. And well, I've done a lot of backpacking and hiking and climbing the mountains, that kind of thing. He had not. He was pretty cityfied. It was a real city boy. And he said, well, where are you going to sleep? I said, I'm going to sleep outside. And he said, well, did you bring a tent? And I said, no, I'm going to sleep under the stars. He said, you're going to what? So I said, come on, bring your sleeping bag. And so we went out and slept under the stars, and that really got him hooked. As far as camping out and camping under the stars. We had a great relationship, both in the law, but also in Boy Scouting.
I'm going to turn a little bit to your family, your lovely wife and good friend of mine, Norma, and your children. Tell us about Norma. First of all, tell me about how you met Norma. I've known Norma as long as I've known you, which has been since 1969, I think. Mm-hmm. But tell us how you met Norma.
We were high school sweethearts, but not in the same high school. I was at Lincoln High and she was at Lincoln Northeast. I had gone to a party where apparently I'd been a little bit of a show-off. And when it was sometime later, it was sitting at what was then called the Kellogg Center. There at 33rd and, what was that, 33rd and Holdridge, is that right, I think, in Lincoln. And it was the Governor's Youth Conference, and we were both there. And I was sitting there, I didn't have a ride home, and I was waiting for a ride when all of a sudden this really cute young girl came up to me.
Indeed.
Yeah, and she said, hello, I'm Norma Mason. And I looked at her, and then she got very embarrassed, because her personality was not to walk up to somebody. And she said, you don't remember me. And I said, no, I don't. So she got very embarrassed, and she walked away and sat down on the other side of the room. And I thought, she's very cute. Maybe I'm making a mistake here. So I got up and I walked over to her and I started talking to her. And started dating, and we kind of had one time that we did not, we kind of drifted apart, and then we had a friend, I don't know if you know Dick Reiser, but Mary Lynn Reiser was from Lincoln Southeast. Now you have a Northeast, Lincoln High, and Southeast.
I know both of the Risers, yes.
Wonderful people. And we were what was a Keen Time dance when all the high schools would get together and dance in Lincoln, which I don't think they do anymore. And she saw me on one side of this crowded room, and Norma was on the other, and she dragged me across. And of course, she couldn't hear me protest because of all the loud music and the cheering and so forth. Got to the other side, and she said, well, here's Norma. So Norma and I then started dancing, and been dancing ever since.
When were you married?
Married in December 1965 in our freshman year of undergrad. We've been married now over 50 years.
My goodness. Tell me about your children.
Well, we have three. Brian is the oldest, and he has some real health issues, and he's on dialysis. He had quite a few years ago now. I mean, hate to guess, but it's been a decade or more, probably a couple decades. Kidney failure, and he's had a kidney transplant, and that has run its course, and he's back on dialysis. But he's worked primarily for insurance companies or securities companies doing accounting. He's kind of very good with numbers and that kind of things. And then Kevin is the next, and Kevin is also very good with numbers, and he works for Google. As we call, he's a Googler. And Google is a wonderful place to work, and he keeps telling me, I'd love to tell you about it, but if I do, you know, I would have to kill you. Because if we think our security at the courthouse is good, the security at Google is far, far superior. But he works with computers, originally with the hardware, now he's more in supervisory capacities. My daughter Erin, she's the youngest, and she is physician's assistant. She worked at, well, she was on a pediatric PA in Lincoln for a while. Then she taught at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And then she taught at Children's, and she's just now leaving Children's Hospital to go to work. Creighton is setting up a new PA program, and she will be teaching at Creighton Medical School. So they're all outstanding people, and I'm very proud of each and every one of them in their field. They're exceptional.
I can attest to that. They're really nice people. Do you have any grandchildren?
I have, well, I have 3 step-grandchildren and 6 direct grandchildren, and I know at one point you're going to ask what I'm going to do, and one of the things I'm going to be doing when I retire is spend more time with them. And they go from, well, my step-grandchildren are probably like 26, 27, 25, and so forth, down to Erin's daughter, who just turned 4. And so we're going to spend more time mainly with the young ones. So
You spend quite a bit of time with your family in Colorado, don't you?
I do, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we love Colorado. We love the mountains. Obviously, Norm and I have been going out there for a long time. We used to go backpacking and climbing and hiking and so forth. We eventually got a cabin in northern Colorado in the middle of nowhere, and I built it, designed it, kind of built it myself, and we ended up selling that, and then we now have a very nice place that somebody else built. It's much better, sturdier, and that's in Estes Park, Colorado, in kind of the heart of it, up on a mountain ridge. And we'll spend a lot of time there. To call it a cabin, but it's a 4, arguably 5-bedroom home. We love it.
Well, next to turn to your practice experience. Tell us a little bit about you practiced law for 28 years, I think, with what I call the Fitzgerald firm.
Mm-hmm.
Just well, I know you tried a patent manure case, and you won it. And I think at the time of your investiture, I said that you were the only circuit judge I'd ever known to turn manure into gold. But that aside, tell us about your practice.
Well, I think you might be interested. I think one of the culprits of this story is now deceased, but I'll tell you how matters have changed with judges and their law clerks. When I was clerking for Judge Lay, I knew at that point there were 2 things I never wanted to be. I never wanted to be a tax lawyer, and I never wanted to be a trial lawyer. And you can't be around Judge Lay very long before you're infected with his enthusiasm for the courtroom and for the trial lawyer. And he firmly believed that you are not a lawyer unless you're a trial lawyer. So somewhere during the year, he decided that I needed to be a trial lawyer, and that the best that I could do would be to go to the Fitzgerald firm, because there were 2 reasons. One was what he thought was one of the best, not the best, trial lawyers in the region was Lyle Stroughton. And that Jim Brown worked there, and Jim Brown, in Judge Lay's view, was the closest to a legal genius he had ever known. And he said the best thing you could do would work for them and learn from them. So he sat at a desk where I was in front of him, and he had his telephone behind him. He turns around, picks up his phone, and he calls and he says, Lyle Strong. Lyle, I got a young man over here to interview for a job for you, and I think you should hire him. And what would work for you for a time to come over? And I know Lyle said, well, we've already hired, we don't have any openings. Lyle later said, but what do you say when a circuit judge calls you and says you need to hire his law clerk? But Judge Lace didn't take that, for an answer. He said, well, you have time, and this is an outstanding young man, Bob. So Lyle says, okay. So I don't know, a few days later I went over and I interviewed with him and went through the whole process. And in an afternoon, so when I came back to work the next morning, Judge Lace said, did they offer you a job? And I said, well, yes, they did. Did you take it? And I said, yes, I did. Well, what are they going to pay you? And I told him, and he didn't say anything, turned around, picked up that phone, and he said, call, give me Lyle Strong. Lyle, that amount of money is not enough. He said, we here at the federal government pay more than that. You need to pay him at least whatever the amount was. And they did. Yeah. Which is probably leads to some of the rules we have now in judicial conduct that we don't do that anymore. But that's how I got the job. And I worked with Lyle Strom a lot, which was a great learning experience. And I would be neglectful if I didn't mention Bill Brennan. Bill Brennan I worked with more than probably Lyle Strom, because Lyle Strom was gone a lot doing depositions and trials and so forth. But I started off doing insurance defense work, odds and ends, and then as you start getting a reputation and trying, they start getting bigger cases. And of course started off in what was then Muni Court, went to state district court and then federal court and so forth. One of the benefits I had early on was that a big client of ours, American Beef Packers, filed bankruptcy, Chapter 11. And when you do that, then all of their customers they sell to won't pay. Figure, well, we got free beef and so on. So my job, and I was the only one, I had to go, they were a Fortune 500, like 250 biggest corporations in the country. And my job was to sue all of these companies and to get them to pay. My decision first was, I'm going to bring them to Omaha. Well, if you probably remember, personal jurisdiction wasn't real solidified at that time. And so I decided to sue the first one in federal court, because federal court was more liberal and broad-minded on personal jurisdiction. And I got old Judge Denny to write an opinion giving me jurisdiction over one of them, but I used as a precedent to get them. And then I went back to state court and started suing them in state court. And most of them did not remove. It stayed in state court. So then I tried a whole series of jury trials to collect them, because they thought the juries, when American Beef went in, people were furious at them because they let all kinds of checks bounce, and farmers. We actually had farmers and ranchers in our lobby of our law office with shotguns threatening our lawyers. And we had designated lawyers. Joe Barmettler would go out and talk them down. I mean, it was a very contentious time. And so they wanted to be in state court to have the local jurors. And example, the very first one, I went in and we were picking the jury, and it was in front of Judge John Burke, one of the great state trial court judges. And I was the plaintiff, and I was asked, had anybody heard of American Beef Packers? And all the hands went up. And they said, well, is there anybody that would influence their decision? And all the hands went up. So I was going down and just talking to one of them, one man said, a very gruff man, and he said, now, that's a company that Frank West had. And I said, yes, it is. He said, well, that lion SOB, he's a crook, and he's a, and he went on and he called him every name, every civil name and every uncivil name that he could think of. And, you know, taken to the jury, and I would ask in my classes when I taught, you know, well, what do you do with that? You've just had your client call everything under the sun
In front of the entire panel.
in front of the entire panel. And my students will say, well, I asked for a mistrial. I said, well, sure, the judge would have granted me a mistrial. But I didn't. They said, well, what would you do? Would you agree with him? I said, well, no, I wouldn't agree with him. But what I did was, I said, now, Mr. Jones, you understand that I'm here representing American Beef Packers debtor in possession. And it's my job to recover monies from the people we sold product to so that we can pay those farmers and ranchers back some of their money. And that's why I'm here. Well, of course, objection, objection. And the judge said, well, I think under the circumstances, I'll let Mr. Riley explain why we're here. And you could just see they turn 180 degrees. And that came up in every case, not quite as brusquely as that guy did. And we won every single one. We got unanimous jury verdicts, and you know, we're talking about StarKist and General Foods and General Mills and a lot of big companies. And after a series of those, they finally gave up and started paying us. But it took quite a few jury trials to show that they couldn't win to the juries in Omaha.
You mentioned, and I've mentioned Judge Strom, and you've also mentioned Judge Lay, and I want to talk to you a little more about how you got the job with Judge Lay. How did that work out?
Well, you know just as well as I do.
That's why I'm asking you the story.
Well, a young outstanding student in Nebraska named Rich Cuff and I, along with several other very outstanding students, interviewed these two federal judges at the Nebraska Law School. I think there were 5 or 6 of us. And I know that both of us were asked to do it, and I know as far as my knowledge was, and I think yours was the same, was, well, what's this law clerk thing? We had no idea what it was all about, and didn't know anything about the judges or anything. Well, after the interviews, they decided that they wanted Rich Cupp and Bill Riley. And they announced that they didn't care which judge got the other. One was Circuit Judge Don Ross and Circuit Judge Don Lay. And they wanted us to come to Omaha to interview, and we drove, I can't remember if it was on the drive up or the drive back.
Was it drive up? Yeah.
Was it the drive up? The question was, well, which judge would one of us clerk with? Well, at that point, I had a job offer to go to Kansas City and work at was then called Stinson, Mag and Frizzell in Kansas City. And this other outstanding student did not have a job offer. And so the difference was Judge Lay had a 1-year clerkship and Judge Ross had a 2-year clerkship. And since we didn't know either one of them, my suggestion was, well, I've got a job, you don't. And so why don't I take the 1-year clerkship and you take the 2-year clerkship, and that way it gives him another year to help get a job. And so that was logical but not necessarily academic reason of how I ended up working for Judge Lay, and you ended up working for Judge Ross.
And then you told Stinson Mag, no, I'm not coming.
That's right. Yeah, a year later I ended up they offered me a job again, and they ended up working for Fitzgerald
So, long time in the practice of law, highly regarded, making obscene sums of money.
I wish.
And a certain senator interviews you for a job. Tell us about that.
Well, let me back up just a minute. When the position opened up, it was in the district court.
Correct?
And I thought, you know, I'd like to be a district judge. I tried cases in front of Judge Cuff, and I figured, gosh, I could do that well. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe I could do this job. So when the position opened up, I talked to Norm about it. I said, I don't know anything about it. And I was not involved in politics at all. I was a Republican, and that just meant I went, whatever it was, and voted. And so nothing really else. So it was my wife Norma that talked me into it, and she said, well, you'll never know unless you apply. So I applied to be a district judge. I interviewed, I remember I followed the interview with Stu Dornan. And so I don't think they'd made the decision about the circuit yet. I think I was still on the list of the district court nominees, and I met with Senator Chuck Hagel, and later the Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, at his office in Omaha. As I said, Stu Dornan walked out just then. We greeted each other, and then I went in. I was quite impressed with Senator Hagel because he was very bright, all business. I mean, there was no joking around or chit chat. And I remember at one point somebody came in and asked him a question and said, you know, you need to come out in a minute. So he goes and leaves. He had just asked me a question, and I can't remember the question, but I remember it was a hard one. He came back in, and I thought, well, this is good. He will have forgotten the question, and I won't have to answer it. He came in down and said, okay, now what's your answer to that hard question? And I was impressed that he had no notes. But I interviewed with him, and then somewhere along the line, the White House council people decided that there was an opening. Judge Arlen Beam, had also taken senior status. And I got a call from Washington, D.C. saying, or I guess it was Senator Hagel's office, saying we're going to send a list of names to White House. And in the conversation, I didn't hear it first, and I said, well, wait a minute, what list did you say? And he said, well, it's a list to the Court of Appeals. And I said, well, wait a minute, I didn't apply for that. I clerked at the Court of Appeals. These were my exact words. I clerked for the Court of Appeals. I know what it's like to work at the Court of Appeals, and I do not want to work at the Court of Appeals. Well, that kind of stunned them. And so they said, well, let's get back to you. And then I said, well, if, you know, when I don't get the Court of Appeals job, can I still be considered for the district court? And they said, well, we'll get back to you. Well, they got back and said, yes, we'd still consider you for the district court. And so they sent, and it was one of 5 names. It was the Speaker of the Legislature. I can't remember his first name, Doug Christensen? Or
Chancellor Carney now.
Okay. Outstanding trial lawyer in Lincoln, Fred Kaufman. The Attorney General from Nebraska, Don Stenberg. And then this outstanding Chief Judge of the District Court of Nebraska, who I thought ought to have the job, and that was you, Rich Cupp. And so I figured, you know, what are my chances here? You know, probably around 0. And so they went on, and kind of to finish the story, some time after that, I was starting a jury trial in Omaha. Very serious case where a young boy was in the front of a car, and he riding with his grandma, and had was not, the car ran a stop sign and it hit her and the airbags went off and it broke his neck. And he was quadriplegic. And I'm representing the car company. I'm pretty sure it was Chrysler. And anyway, it was going to be a multi-week trial. It was starting on Monday, and this was a Thursday, and I get a call from the White House counsel's office and said, "This is Courtney Greenwood with the White House counsel's office, and we'd like you to come to Washington, D.C. and interview." And I said, "Sure." And she said, no, I really am with the White House counsel, and you can. I said, "Yeah." I knew this was a joke. I knew that one of my humorous friends, partners or whatever, had set this up. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, Courtney, give me your phone number, I'll call you back because I have this trial started and I would have to talk to the judge and the other lawyers." She says, "Well, okay, it's 2:02. And I think, oh, no, maybe this is real. So I said, my next comment was, "I'll get right back to you, Miss Greenwood." And so I did. I called the judge and the lawyers, and they said, "Well, we'd like to get started with the case, and probably by Thursday or Friday will be okay." So I called her back, and I said, "Miss Greenwood, I could come on Thursday or Friday." "Well, we need you right away, so would you come Thursday?" He said, "Okay." And I said, "Wait a minute, I can't come Thursday because I teach at Creighton Law School Thursday night." And I know this poor woman was thinking, does this rube from Nebraska really want this job? So she said, "Okay, Friday, you come Friday, 1:30. And I said, "Fine. Are you going to send me a letter?" And emails were just coming in at the time, and so were cell phones. But I said, "Would you send me a letter or fax telling me, give me directions?" She said, "Well, do you think you really need it?" I said, "Well, yes." She said, I don't know where to go." She said, "It's the White House." We're in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I said, "Oh, that White House." So I did, and I went and I interviewed with them. And while you're here, I probably said this before, but when I had my White House interview with the #2 guy at the White House counsels, Tim Flanagan and Courtney Greenwood, we were in that conversation. They were asking me questions. It was kind of like a bar exam, just general questions, legal questions. And when, and so I don't remember how it came up, but it came out, "Well, what do you think about the other people?" I said, "I don't know why you're interviewing me because the best person for this job is Chief Judge Rich Cuff." And they were giving out information. They did that question. They said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, he's more experienced. He's very scholarly. He's a good writer." I went through all kinds of wonderful accomplishments and attributes. And they just sat there and listened. And they asked me about the other people, and I said, "I don't know, except Fred Kaufman. I know he's an outstanding trialer." And what had happened in the meantime was the sixth person had come in, and that was Professor Ralph Whitten from Creighton, because he was originally grew up in Texas, and his family knew the Bush family. And as far as I know, the only ones that got interviewed for this job were me and Ralph. And getting back to where we started this conversation with the senator, is Senator Hagel said, "Well, after you meet with those people, I want to talk to you immediately afterwards." So afterwards, it came out, and of course, you're kind of floating, having been at the White House. And I thought, well, I'll just walk up to the Senate. And it was a hot day. And I floated for about 3 blocks, and as you well know, though, it's about a mile. So the rest of it, I was exhausted. And I got up there and I went in, and they called me immediately in, and we sat down in this beautiful room with a fireplace. And of course, the fireplace wasn't on. And just he and I were chatting. He says, "I want to know everything that was asked of you and what was said." Now, Senator Hagel and President Bush were not best of friends, and they became even less friendly after that. But his comment that I remember was, he said, well, I met last night with this Professor Witt, and he said, the way I look at this is that this is Nebraska versus Texas. And he said, Nebraska is not going to win this, or Texas is not going to win this one. And so I figured I had somebody on my side when it went through. But and it was, the other neat thing I remember about that was somebody came in and said, Senator Hagel, you have a meeting down at the someplace, and it starts in a couple minutes. And he said, yeah. And we talked for a couple minutes, and then we talked for another 5 minutes, and then another 10 minutes. And I said, Senator, don't you have a meeting? He said, yeah, don't worry about it. Well, he didn't have a meeting. That was his way to get out of talking with me, was to have somebody come in and say, you have a meeting. But he wanted to know everything that had happened up in this White House interview. And for him, this was the first time he was involved in a judicial nomination. And so he was learning from it, and he was very, very interested in the process.
And the rest, as they say, is history. You were unanimously confirmed in the Senate.
I was.
And there's a story, I think, about you driving in Iowa with your wife and cell phones and your confirmation. Tell us about that.
Well, before the Senate confirmation, after they had decided that I was going to be their nominee, but I didn't know that at the moment. I got a call from Courtney Greenwood, Ms. Greenwood, and I said, she told me, the president's going to call you this weekend, and he's going to nominate you, but he wants to talk to you. He says, well, we need to know where we can reach you. And I said, well, we've got a wedding, friends of ours in Minneapolis. And then we're going up to another friend's cabin in northern Minnesota. So I got the cell phone numbers of everybody, including the friends that were riding in the car with us and so on and so forth. And didn't happen Friday, didn't happen Saturday, didn't happen Sunday. And we were up at friends. I don't know if you know, Chuck Kluver is a lawyer in Omaha. He and his wife Mary have a cabin up there, and he really wanted the president to call his cabin. And we hung around Monday and as late as we could and still get back. So I said, we've got to go. So we got in the car with our friends Gordon and Claudiana Todd, and the women were in the back and the men were in front driving. Well, there's no, I don't know if there is now, but there was no cell phone connection much. We're cutting catty corner across Minnesota. And we finally came to the town called Sauk Center, Minnesota. And it's pouring rain. I mean, buckets. And all of a sudden, Gordon Todd's cell phone rings. And he gets on, what's my secretary, Chris Schneis. And she said, is Bill there? He said, yeah, he's right here. And she said, do you know the President of the United States has been trying to reach you for over 2 hours? And I said, well, no, we've been, I tried to explain it to her. We haven't been anywhere to get a cell phone. So she said, well, call this number. And so I called that number, and it was the President's personal secretary. And I can't remember now what her name was, but I said, Mary, I want to explain, that she said, well, the President's waiting for you. And she cut me off like that and put the President on, and President, of course, George W. Bush. And the things that we didn't talk long, but his comment was, main interest we talked about was Boy Scouts, because he, thought very highly of the Boy Scouts, and he wanted to talk to me about my Boy Scout experience. And, but we're in this car pouring down rain, and when we're waiting for him to get on the line, and I said, well, hello, Mr. President. And everybody in the car just went, and the whole car fogged up. And so I'm talking to him. When we get done, and he was very cordial, and I said, well, it's a real honor. And he said, well, I don't know how much of an honor it is, but it's nice to talk to you. The one thing I noticed was when a casual conversation, it was a very Texas drawl. I mean, he talked like he was, down here. How you doing there? Rather than what you hear publicly. And when we hung up, Claudiana Todd in the back said, well, we've got to take a picture here where we are. And I said, it's raining out. She said, I don't care, we're gonna get our cameras. So we went into this, we had pulled over and we were in the driveway of, I think it was Mel's Body Shop. One stall body shop. So we went in and we walked in, and here a guy sitting in the counter, and it says Mel. And right on his shirt. Well, Claudiana runs up and says, would you come outside and take a picture of us? And he said, lady, it's raining, it's pouring out. She said, well, he just talked to the president. And the guy looked at us and said, the president of what? and she said, president of the United States. So Mel gets out of behind the counter, comes around, goes out of the rain, and takes a couple pictures of us in front of his body shop. And I have no idea where those pictures are, but that was the conversation I had with the president on the cell phone. So it was kind of a rough moment.
So in 2001, you become a circuit judge. Tell us about the first couple of years.
Well, you probably heard this or we've talked about it, but the first couple of years were miserable. And I know you went through this, some probably becoming a magistrate and then again as a district judge, but when I came from private practice, I thought I had a fairly broad practice, but I got into being a judge and found out that probably 95% of what I was doing as a judge I had never touched on. Maybe in law school, some of it, but not what we were doing. 2255, 2254, I'd never even heard of. Strickland versus Washington, I didn't deal with those kind of things. So it was a huge learning curve. And my wonderful Secretary Chris Nice and I, and our law clerks to some degree, but she and I worked 7 to 7, 7 days a week. I mean, maybe she didn't do the weekends quite that much, but then I'd take work home. And that was that way for a year and a half to 2 years. Huge learning curve. And I know Judge George Fagg, what a hard-working man is, and he had a practice of being in the office like 4:30 or 5 in the morning.
Right.
And the first day I came into work, I had what we call administrative panel matters, where there'd be panels that have to make decisions on things. I came in that first day, and here was email from him already telling me what he thinks. And every morning, even though I got in at 7 a.m., he was already sending me emails telling me what he thought ought to be decided. And he and I were on the panel for those first few months. So I don't know when it was, about 3 months into it probably. And one of the judges, Judge Kermit Bai from Fargo, North Dakota, had been a trial lawyer and a lobbyist. And so I knew he had come somewhat similar background, so I called him up and I said, Kermit, I am just absolutely overwhelmed here. I said, does this ever get easier? And we talked about it, and he essentially said, give it 2 years. He said, it'll come together within 2 years. And he was right. It started coming together, and you start seeing the same things over and over again. And then you start looking for something new and different. But it was very difficult the first couple of years, and for Chris too. And the district court was kind enough to let us use chambers, the other corner of this floor. But it was not built for a circuit judge, and it doesn't have storage. And we were, back then, nothing was electronic, and we just, boxes and boxes of stuff coming in. We had piled all over the chambers, for briefs and records and all kinds of material that we had. So we were buried with paper and overwhelmed for those first 2 years, but it finally came together.
Just for the purposes of our record, we're in Omaha, Nebraska, at the Roman El Huasca Courthouse, and your chambers are on the, it's a 6-story building, but 2 of those stories are below ground, so you're on the 4th floor. And you've been chambered here since your appointment?
Yes.
Okay. Let's turn now to how you use your law clerks. I'm interested in knowing what your practices are more generally and whatever else you'd like to add.
First of all, you well know, and I think almost any judge knows, your law clerks become like family. They become very close to them, some more than others, but generally speaking, all of them. In the first few years, one of the reasons I worked so hard was I tried to do everything that they were doing. It was very duplicative. And once I got more confidence in the law and the procedures, and I could rely on them more, I didn't have to go back and look at everything they looked at. So if you have a big case in a record, or any record for any case, I got to the point I wasn't going to read that record. They would highlight it. They would point out to me what are the key parts, the key testimony, or the key discussions with the court or whatever on a ruling of evidence or whatever, or an agency files. And I became confident enough that I could rely on that. So my law clerks were the ones that would read the record. And they would read it. It depended on the issue. If it was an issue of sufficiency of the evidence, they're going to read everything. But if it's an issue on a narrow thing like, did Judge Cup make a right evidentiary ruling on a certain thing? Well, that's pretty limited what you need to look at. But I soon had them reviewing all the record. And then I got to the point where I went from reading all the cases to more relying on them to read the cases and that were cited or they found that, and have them highlight them, and then I would read the cases where they would highlight. Now that might cause me to go back and read the whole case and look at that, but and then they would draft up opinions, and that. To back up, when the year begins, my law clerks I would have for either 1 year or 2 years, and I had a few for longer than that. And I had a career law clerk, an outstanding lawyer, Jeff Mindrup. I think he was there about 5 or 6 years, but generally speaking, they would be here for 2 years or 1 year. And they would, I'd start off and I'd sit at this same table, and we'd have a conference at the beginning on a checklist of what your job is, and everything from duty of confidentiality and loyalty and so forth, to what about reviewing the record and looking up cases and so forth. And one of the things that I wanted them to know, and of course I've had a lot of law clerks with differing political views, philosophical views, legal views, and I told him, you have to put this aside, because I said, I do not have an agenda. I'm not here to change the law in any respect. I'm here to try to figure out what's the right answer, and that's what you're here to do, is to help me figure out the right answer by reviewing the law, reviewing the record. And once in a while I'd have some that really wanted to push push me in the law a certain direction, and you'd have to say, no, no, we have precedent here, or I don't think the Supreme Court would go there. And you, but let them know what their job is, and then turn them loose. And I always overlapped them, so I always had at least one law clerk here that had worked for a year or two, and would then be able to also help train them. And a lot of the training the law clerks got, I think, was the interaction among themselves. A big benefit, you know, in the district court, you have 2, maybe 3 if you have a special, but we had 4. And what they learn among themselves, and I know when you clerked and when I clerked, working with our co-clerks was awfully beneficial, bouncing things off them. So I used them that way. They would draft opinion, and because we are a publishing precedent court, we go through a very elaborate process of trying to make those opinions accurate. They will draft it, and then they will circulate it among the other law clerks and get their views, and they will critique it before I ever see it. Now, we would have had an oral argument on it, I would have, with a bench memo maybe, but we would have an oral argument. I would have told them where I thought this case was going to come out, and that they go from there. But when they draft opinion, then all the law clerks critique it, and I say, I want to see their critiques. I don't, not just going to take your word of what the other critiques are. So they write it, usually handwritten on the draft opinions, and then the law clerk will advise them, and they bring a draft to me, and then I look at that, and I look at all the other law clerks' critiques, and then I go back through the record, and I go back through the cases. Anything that's cited in there, referred to in there, I will look at. Then it goes back, whatever changes I make will go back to the law clerk who had drafted it. They'll make those changes. If they don't agree, then we have a discussion, and we will have sometimes a debate on what's the right answer. And then when we get it done with that, I'll have another law clerk spade it and go through, spading, for those that don't know, that means you go back and you check all the citations and you check all the reference to the record and so forth, make sure it's accurate. And then it comes back to me to see what changes are. And then it goes to my secretary, Chris, and she reads it to make sure it's in compliance. She has 2 jobs: to make sure it's in compliance with the 8th Circuit rules and standards, and second, she reads it as somewhat of a layperson. And sometimes, we write these things for lawyers or whatever, and because I told her, these are mainly for non-lawyers out there. So she'll make suggestions about the phraseology or word choice or whatever, as well as grammatical and so. And when she gets done, I look at that, make some changes, and the last thing does, and the law clerk that drafted it, and one law clerk, and they read it out loud. And it's surprising when you sit and read it out loud that all of a sudden some sentence that's sounded perfectly fine when you're reading it in your mind, you read it out loud, it's just gibberish, or it goes on too long, or...
That was, you might be interested in knowing, was the final thing that happened in Judge Ross's chambers. Mm-hmm. The law clerk would read out loud the opinion to we called her secretary, now judicial assistant, mm-hmm. or vice versa. And it's surprising, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
What you find.
And things will jump out.
Yeah.
It could be little things there. T-H-E-R-E should be T-H-E-I-R.
Right.
And you go, why do we all miss this? So anyway, then of course, district judge, you're done. But we send it out to 2 other judges, and they come back with their comments. And most of the time, I'm pleased to concur in your opinion. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they find typographical errors. Sometimes they say, well, I could go along with it, except this language is a little too strong, or I think we need to beef up this language. And so you end up, I soon learned what a majority of 3 is. You got to get at least one judge to go along with your opinion, and then write. Then the law clerk will really work through whatever the judge's comments are. So they do work awfully hard. I also have them. Let me back up a minute. There's really 4 parts to a circuit judge's job. One is the drafting opinions and oral arguments, what everybody thinks about. But we have reading petitions for rehearing. For anybody, if you're an acting judge, you have to read all that. I never gave that to the law clerks. I always did that to see if there was an issue that maybe we ought to have rehearing on. We have what we call screening cases, which are cases that go without argument that staff attorneys in St. Louis have worked on. I never gave that to my law clerks. I always did all that. We already had a lawyer in St. Louis that was working on it. It gets a little more detailed than that. But then another area is the administrative panel matters, which get everything from a motion for a continuance to a motion for a stay of execution, and all kinds of things in between, or stay of deportation, so there can be some important things in there that are not just routine. And I did all those. I don't think I ever asked the law clerks to do any of those things. So those 3 areas, administrative panel, screening panels, and PFRs, petitions for rehearing, I did everything on that. And their whole job was to work with what I always did with the tougher cases, which are usually the argued cases.
I'm going to switch a little bit on you now. It's 2010 and you become chief judge. So you've been on the bench, roughly 9 years? So tell us about, and you served roughly 7 years as chief judge. Tell us about how easy being chief judge is. You're the chief judge of the entire circuit, which means you have responsibility not only for the Court of Appeals, but each of the district courts as well.
The way I describe it to people is the 8th Circuit comprises 7 states, from the Louisiana border to the Canadian border, from the Mississippi River to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It is a huge circuit. And of course we know those 7 states are Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. And we have courthouses all over that. We have judges, all that. And as chief judge, you're responsible for all of that. You're responsible for make sure the judges are happy and there's everything's working smoothly. About the courthouses, one of the things here, we closed our library here, and for the record, that sounds bad, but we're using electronics anymore, so we didn't need a library. You're working on personnel matters. You have to plan. It starts over 2 years in advance to plan a judicial conference for the judges, and then one for the judges and the lawyers. And then you preside over the Judicial Council of the circuit, which that's all of the Court of Appeals judges plus a district judge representative from each of the districts. And that's really the administrative body of the circuit, and it's kind of the ultimate power. There's certain parts of the statute says the chief judge will do this and the chief judge will do that, but generally speaking, the chief judge's power comes from presiding over the Judicial Council. And I did not come in with any particular agenda or anything other than one thing that I wanted to do was to get the district judges, the Judicial Council in particular, but also all judges, all the rest of the district judges and the magistrate judges and the banquet judges, more involved in the process. And up till then, at least my experience had been that it came in and the Court of Appeals judges and the chief judge kind of dictated everything that was going to happen, and you know, you may or may not agree with that, but it was kind of top down, and I wanted to make it more bottom up.
And I'll just interject, I do agree with you, and I do think, this is my opinion, that you have made it more bottom up, and thank you.
Well, you're welcome. But we have, a lot of this I know is going to the audience, but much of it you know, but the Judicial Council operates through committees. And one thing the chief judge appoints all the committees. And so spent a lot of time putting people on these committees that I thought would be interested in it, but even if they said, well, I'm interested in this committee, but I thought they might be better somewhere else, I'd put them where I thought they ought to be. And I tried to put the district judges on committees, and the district judges never chaired a committee until 2 or 3 years into my reign, and then I started making them chairs of some of these committees. And, you know, they did just fine. I think some of the Court of Appeals judges started realizing, you know, this is, you know, yeah, dump it on them, let them deal with it. So, but I really did, that was one goal, was to get them more involved. Another thing is Judge Cuff knows, is one thing the chief judge does is fill in, well, two things. One is, if the judges of the District of Nebraska recuse themselves, they got to find another judge to come in. It goes to the chief judge, and the chief judge finds somebody else in the 8th Circuit to fill in. And I never had, and I did that all over a lot of times. You can imagine in bigger districts in Missouri, Minnesota, and so forth, there were a lot of those. I never had anybody tell me no, and I really appreciated that. And I tried to distribute it where people, I thought maybe were not quite as busy, or I thought they would fit in well with another district. I picked on the District of North Dakota a lot because I knew, I had, as chief judge, I had the information on their dockets, and I knew that they were not particularly as busy as some. So Ralph Erickson and to a lesser degree Dan Hovland, who kind of is out in the middle of the state, would fill in a lot of Minnesota and sometimes other places. So back it up to where I was really headed on this, and that was sitting on the Court of Appeals, when we had a lot of cases where we didn't have enough Court of Appeals judges to cover it. And so historically, we would go outside the circuit and find other circuit judges around the country. And I know I'm not going to attribute to anybody, but I know that some judges on our court felt that only Court of Appeals judges should be sitting on these cases. Well, that was not my view. My view was two. One is that our district judges in this circuit know our law. They're not coming in from the outside and have to figure out what it is. And secondly, they're just as qualified there, but for the grace of God, they could be Court of Appeals judges. So I, with very few exceptions, one or two, I think all of these, and there were a lot of designated judges that sat on the Court of Appeals, but I just drew on our district judges to sit on there. And I know some of them weren't interested in it. They never said no, but some of them really liked to do it. Others, they're a little more reluctant. But I think I got a lot of them in there, and some of them a lot of times.
So you're being chief judge at the same time you're being an active circuit judge. Mm-hmm. So what do you do for fun?
Well, it's very busy. The best way to explain this is to say March 10th was my last day as chief judge. So on Monday the 13th, I think that probably since March 13th, I've had about 5 phone calls here in whatever this has been, 3 months, over 3 months, where I was getting sometimes 5 an hour, or certainly multiple calls during the day, and emails and so forth. So the workload as far as having to make decision on little things, they're not little to the people that are asking, but more routine things was almost constant.
Not only were you serving as chief judge and then as an active circuit judge, but you served on the Judicial Conference Committee on the Criminal Law, and then very significantly, you served as a member of the Executive Committee of the Judicial Conference. Why don't you tell us about those 2 experiences?
The whole judiciary of the United States is governed by the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is the Chief Justice of the United States, who is now John Roberts, was Chief Justice Rehnquist when I started, but Justice Roberts. He picks those people and or works with them. He sets the committees, and it also operates in a committee structure, and one of those is a criminal law committee. And Chief Justice Rehnquist put me on that, and Chief Justice Roberts put me on that. And I served on that for 6 years. And that was before I became chief judge. Once I became chief judge, the Judicial Conference of the United States is made up of all of the chief judges of all the circuits, and then a district court representative from each circuit. So our circuit well, it depends, every 1 year, sometimes we've done it 3 or 4 years, will elect a district judge to serve there. For example, Judge Linda Reed is now serving there, but when I was there, Judge Karen Schreier was there for a while. Judge Rod Sipple was there for a while. And that Judge Reed from Iowa, Judge Schreier from South Dakota, and Judge Sipple from Missouri. And then we would sit in this big, beautiful place in the Supreme Court, big conference room. It's just gorgeous. And our circuit, the district judge always sits closest to the head of this gigantic table, and then I would sit there, and then of course to my left would be the 10th or the 7th Circuit. To our right would be the 9th, and it was very, very interesting. Although really, again, it was the committee structure that operates, that filters up to there, to what is called the executive committee of this big body of judges. The executive committee is a group of 7 judges that are all selected by the Chief Justice to serve in the absence of the Judicial Conference of the United States, which only meets twice a year. So 354 days a year, the executive committee is the one that would be making decisions or creating the record to give to the Judicial Conference. And it really does, the executive committee really does primarily operate administratively the whole judiciary. That doesn't mean that it's making, pushing and guiding things. It's more of a deliberative body that says, okay, how's the best way to handle these things? And again, the committee structure, things come up through the executive committee, and it decides whether that's a good idea or not so good, or we ought to go back and research this more before we do it. During my tenure, I was on it, the executive committee. I was chosen by Chief Justice Roberts. In fact, there's his letter up there to be on the executive committee, and I served on that for about 5 years, something short of 5 years. And during that time, we had sequestration, which people in the future may not know what that was, but it's where they tied up the funds in the budget, and it really put a real crimp in the federal judiciary's budget. And so we were moving money and trying to make sure that we had money to operate. and where should we cut and where should we not cut and so forth. And that was a very tumultuous time. We had a lot of issues that would deal with public defenders. They're always pushing for more power over themselves, and we're kind of always reining them back a little bit.
Let me interrupt for just a minute. In the federal system, the federal public defenders are, it may seem odd to other people, but are an arm of the judiciary, and that was intended to protect the defenders, to give them a safe place to function where they might be free of the political winds, so to speak. I think that's the thinking.
Yes, and also to be out of a system that gives them some protection over the prosecutors who are in the executive branch. And you stop and think, well, where else would you put them? But there is friction there.
Sure.
And plus we as judges, and one of the things I do as chief judge that people don't realize, that any time a public well, not a public defender, but a Criminal Justice Act lawyer appointee goes over a statutory maximum, then I have to look at it. One of the time-consuming things I did was reviewing CJA vouchers, Criminal Justice Act vouchers. Well, they work very closely together, the public defenders and the CJA lawyers, and that was kind of a constant issue that we on the executive committee had. We got also into judicial, I don't know what you want to call it, but maybe judges that were working too long. How do we deal with judges that maybe were having some mental issues or health, any health issue, and we worked on matters for that. We had one, during my time on there, we had one district judge that we recommended to the Congress be impeached. That was tough, and a lot of work went into that. We handled a lot of things. Later, probably a couple years into that, the Chief Justice also designated me as the long-range planning coordinator for the whole federal judiciary, and I had a committee of one, me. But I had a lot of help from the administrative offices, the U.S. courts, with a very good lawyer named Brian Lynch. And a lot of long-range planning happens, and we do long-range planning through the committees, the judicial conference committees. We also go back to the chief judges in the districts and the courts of appeals and so forth. One part of that is budgeting. One of the things when I came in, the long-range planning, they weren't doing anything with regard to money. And one of the things I said, we got to realize that, I think sequestration was on the horizon. We've got to figure out our planning. What do we do when it comes into budgets? Another thing, more recently, just in the last year, I'm still a coordinator. They talked me into staying until the last day. They said, so August 31, 2017 is my last day as an active senior judge, and this is my last day as judicial coordinator, long-range planning. But anyway, we set priorities, and we just, every 5 years, so I was part of leading the process to set new priorities for the judiciary. For the most part, they were the same, but one that was not even considered in the past and became our #1 priority. Now, historically, this may not, may be kind of obvious, but at the time, it wasn't obvious because it wasn't even in our prior strategic plans, we call it. It wasn't in our strategic plans, and now it's our #1 priority, and that is cybersecurity. Because the judiciary is being hacked constantly, as the Chief Justice says, over 1,000 times a month. And that was quite a while ago he said that. My guess is it's much more than that now. And it has been totally hacked by what people suspect were the Chinese. And so we had to address that. And, you know, I don't know if you know, but you know, Merrick Garland, who President Obama had appointed to the Supreme Court. He and I, on the executive committee, were the ones that were pushing cybersecurity, and we were bringing people in the administrative offices to do those things and kind of challenging them. Well, what are you doing, and what can be done, and what do we need, and do we need more money? Do we need more people? What kind of people do we need? And I remember asking one of the head person for intellectual property or technology, IT people. I said, well, what do we do to be as good or better than the private industry? And I mentioned my son Kevin at Google. I said, well, how can we be as good or better than Google? He kind of looked at me and backed up and he said, that's never going to happen. And I said, well, why? And he said, we cannot offer enough money to hire the kind of people the private industry does, the Googles, the Microsoft, whoever it might be. We can offer more money, but we sell the kind of the benefit program of the judiciary and so forth. And I really didn't want to ask him what that meant because I was afraid what it meant was we don't work as hard. But anyway, it was Merrick Garland and I that were challenging them to say, you know, you've got to, you know, we've got to get on top of this. So that's the executive committee tries to do those kinds of things of organizing and setting priorities and having a method to try to accomplish whatever goals we have. And then the strategic planning coordinator that I was is kind of in charge of that.
Well, I think it's fair to say that you were at the very pinnacle of the administration of all of the U.S. courts in the United States for 5 years. And that brought you in intimate contact with Chief Justice Roberts. And I think you and he have become good friends.
I wouldn't say good friends, but friends, yes.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about the Chief Justice.
And I would say, well, the reason I say not good friends is, and I'll tell you in a minute some of the things I've done with him, but he is always the Chief Justice. He does not let his guard down at all. I have never been in the circumstance where he's let his guard down. I'm sure at home, maybe with some friends, he can relax and not be it, but he was always Chief Justice. And that's why I say we were friends, but you know, not let's go out to the bar and have a drink,
Sure.
friend. I admire him greatly. He's a superb administrator. He runs the meetings and so forth. But the way we interact was when the judicial conference meets, he chairs it, and then he has, before the meeting, he meets with all the district judges, and after the meeting, he will meet with the Court of Appeals chief judges, and we have breakfast with him at the Supreme Court, which is really a cool deal to have the Supreme Court right off of his chambers, and so in those more intimate relationships, my contact with him really became much. I wanted to bring him back to Nebraska and to the 8th Circuit, which were two different projects, and I found out that what he called his counselor, which is really his right-hand man, had spent some of his youth growing up in Omaha. Mm-hmm. And so then I started really working with him and say, you know, I got to get the Chief Justice to come back. And he set the Chief Justice's schedule. And I talked to the Chief Justice about it a lot, but much more with with Jeff Manier is his name. Jeff Manier and I were talking on the phone or when we were back there. And we eventually got him to come to Nebraska. And Jeff told me, the Chief Justice didn't say this, but Jeff told me, he said, the Chief Justice wants to thank you for all the work that you've done, and he will come to Nebraska, into the 8th Circuit, I can't remember exact words, but since thank you for the work you've done. Plus he had a goal to come visit all the circuits at their conferences eventually, and to go to every state. He'd not been to Nebraska, he'd not been to the 8th Circuit. And Jeff Manier said he wants to come while you're Chief Judge. And so we're not, I wouldn't say good friends, but we know each other fairly well, and have a mutual respect. And so he did come.
You both went to a Nebraska football game.
That's true.
And sat next to one another. And who did he cheer for?
Well, that's a little story ahead. Again, he's the Chief Justice of everybody.
I realize that.
But he came to Nebraska, and we did a video recording for anybody, for the public, but it was mainly Nebraska law school students. We also put it out on the Nebraska network to watch, high schools watch, and so forth. And I asked the questions. Now, Jeff Manier wanted to see the questions ahead of time. And I said, fine, so I did the questions. He called me back. He had a couple little tweaks, and that was it. So I assumed, my big blunder of this whole thing was, I assumed that if Jeff Manier saw him, the Chief Justice saw him. So here we are on TV and everybody out there, and I announced, it's wonderful to have the Chief Justice of the United States here, so forth. And I have some questions to ask him, which he's seen in advance, and so I go. He had not looked at them. He does not like to know what the questions are. He'd rather handle them extemporaneously and just respond. But he was kind enough. He never said anything. He never said, no, I've never seen. He just went on. Well, we did go to the football game the next day, and by then, all the news coverage said, well, he was asked prepared questions that he was new of, the media picked up on all this. And of course he hadn't. And that was my mistake. But he never said anything about it. He never was critical or anything.
But you later corrected it in Arkansas when he came. And you interviewed him, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And you made it very clear, as I recall, that he had not had prepared questions given to him. And I will simply say that the interview was one of the most fascinating, intellectually interesting experiences of my life. You did a great job, and the Chief Justice is a smooth operator. He did this all extemporaneously, as I recall.
And did not know those questions either.
That's my recollection.
Let me finish the football one and that one, but let me finish that one. What I remember is I was asking these questions, and I introduced one of them. I said, well, this is a question I'd asked at Nebraska. And he had some, what I thought were very important answers. So I asked him, I said, would you like to tell the audience about such and such? And he looked at me and he said, no. Just left me hanging there, and I could see the twinkle in his eye. I don't know if you remember that. He was doing that on purpose. It just left me hanging there. And so I answered it. They said, well, in Nebraska, he said such and such. And he just let me answer it. Back to football. So the next day we go to the football game, and they had with some of the big boosters, they had a little luncheon, and he wasn't apt to speak or anything, but he was there. And I walked up to him, I just apologized for saying that. I said, because in the meantime, Jeff Manier had told me that he had not reviewed the questions. He said, oh, that's no problem. I said, don't worry about it. So, so he's sitting right there, and the chancellor of the university then was
Harvey Perlman.
Harvey Perlman. So Harvey Perlman gets up and he introduces the Chief Justice, and he introduces me. And then he says, Harvey Perlman, Chancellor of the University, says, with all these big boosters and all these things, he said, and as I understand, I gave Judge Riley his lowest grade in law school, which he did.
Chancellor Perlman was previously the dean of the law school, and prior to that was a torts professor, if I recall correctly.
And I had him actually for domestic relations, and they just changed the divorce laws in Nebraska. And anyway, that's another story. But we did have him back in Arkansas, and he was very charming there. And Norm and I went out back to Nebraska. Norm and I went out to dinner with him and Jeff Manier and Jeff Manier's wife in Nebraska. And that was the closest to letting his hair down. We talked about our family histories and kind of things we like to do and so forth. And but again, he was still the chief. You were having a casual conversation with the Chief Justice, but he is a brilliant, charming man, and it was just certainly one of the highlights of my career was getting to know with him and work with him.
Well, Judge, I want to, do you have any remarks you'd like to make about your colleagues on the 8th Circuit? I mean, generalizations.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure working with all of them. We've all gotten along well. Obviously, you become maybe closer to someone than others, but we all work, and we work very hard, and all the judges work hard to be congenial. And that may sound logical, or of course they do. No, that's not true. I know circuits that remain anonymous, and I know very accurately that about half the court does not speak to the other half of the court. Judges will not talk to other judges. It's like you and I can even work in the same building and not talk to each other. And they write very, I don't know, harshly to each other. In fact, from our court, Judge, we had one of the things we did on my watch as Chief Judge is we have come to an agreement where we can take bankruptcy judge positions that we have in the 8th Circuit that are not filled because we don't need them, and we're moving them to other places where they really need bankruptcy judges. And one of them was in Florida, and the other one was in Michigan. And so they're technically 8th Circuit bankruptcy judges, but they're actually from Central Florida or Detroit. And so I had appointed 3 judges from our circuit to go be with 3 judges from the Middle District of Florida, and 3 judges up in well, actually the 5th Circuit and then the 6th Circuit. And to hire somebody. Now, we made the hire, but we really let them pretty much decide it because it was going to be their judge. And it confirmed what we found out. And Judge Dwayne Benton of Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, from our court, was the chair of that committee, and he confirmed to me that he said, our court is just a pleasure to work with because he's working with these circuit judges, and I don't want to get into any specifics, sure, but it was just not the same atmosphere. So I thank them for that, and it's an atmosphere that we work hard at, and they're all wonderful. I'd have to mention, I hate to mention any individual judges because then you leave somebody out, but before he passed away, I got to work with Richard Arnold. And as Judge Cuff knows, and anybody in the 8th Circuit, what a brilliant mind and what the consummate gentleman that he was. And I sat with him on several panels. I had set up a panel in North Platte. That turned out to be 2 panels, so we could be in western Nebraska to show the flag and play a little golf at the Sandhills Golf Course. Richard Arnold was a wonderful golfer, and he was not in good health. And he made it through 9 holes, beat everybody for 9 holes, and then he came and he stayed for dinner, but then he asked Norman me to take him back to Lincoln to get a car because he just didn't feel well. So I got to ride home with him, or driving back. And over the years, got to know him. When he passed away, a lot of people said he was, probably one of the greatest legal minds ever to not be on the Supreme Court. Learned hand, they put him in the category with learned hand. He was such a marvelous person. And it's also reflective of the 8th Circuit and all the judges about how, how friendly and nice they are to people. So I would just say it's a very congenial court, and they really do. We agree on most things, but when we don't agree, it is congenial. We rarely write tough opinions attacking the other side, and that's not always been the case on our court or certainly other courts.
I'll just make a quick observation. I think that in large part, was because of Judge Richard Arnold. He brought, in my opinion, his overarching brilliance, but just the kindest, decent man in the world. And I think he became a circuit judge in '80.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And I don't think one can underestimate the impact that Judge Arnold had, not only on the law, but the collegiality about which you speak.
Well, and for the record, Richard Arnold was from Arkansas. I grew up in Texarkana, Arkansas, but lived in Little Rock and out of Arkansas.
Well, we're nearing the end. If you were to write a book about the 8th Circuit, you talked about the collegiality. So set that aside for a moment. What would be in your book?
About the 8th Circuit?
Yeah.
The thing, and I know you had mentioned earlier before we started this about what do I, maybe opinions or something that I don't remember opinions so much as I remember people. And I remember certain lawyers. I remember, obviously, the judges. Many of the judges when I came on the court are no longer with us. Not only Richard Arnold, but Ted McMillian, who was the first black judge in the 8th Circuit. Wonderful man in the same vein of collegiality as Richard Arnold. Don Ross, I got to sit with him one time. First time I sat and the last time he sat. But anyway, I remember the individuals, and yes, some of us are characters, but I would include the district judges and the bankruptcy judges. I can't say I know all of them, and the magistrate judges, I can't say I know all of them, but I would probably know most of the district judges. Some of the new ones coming on I don't know as well, but to me it's a big judicial family, and that's one thing as chief judge I tried to encourage, was we're all in this together. And for the most part, that's worked out. And I think the history of the court, we don't always agree, but I think we all always get along.
This is an odd question and maybe an unfair one, but I've been unfair most of my life, so I'm going to ask it. How do you want to be remembered?
I've never thought about that. I hope I'm remembered as as a judge is not somebody that came with some sort of an agenda or trying to push my own views on things, that somebody that wanted to find out what was right under the laws that stands today. It may not always be that way, but as it stands today. And take the facts as we find them. And when I instruct my law clerks, I said, you know, sometimes we may look at something and say that this is the way it ought to be, but we can't, the facts don't support it, or the law doesn't support it. And to do what's right based on the facts of a particular case and the law that they apply. And the other thing I would say would be hopefully congeniality. You know, I never know when people are sincere or just blowing smoke, but they're, when I stepped down as chief judge, there were a lot of nice things that were said by, but not only judges, probably less by judges, but more by staff and, well, district judges. I got some very nice comments by district judges. That clicking's my phone. Should have turned it off. And about what we were talking about is the collegiality and getting along with people. And I don't want to repeat some of the things that embarrassed me when I read it or they spoke it, but I'm going to repeat it here. But I hope that they thought that I helped keep the court, and I mean the whole 8th Circuit, running well and collegially and so forth. And again, I don't expect to have any, you know, he wrote this opinion. I've had the Supreme Court affirm me, and I've had them reverse me. One of my laughing at Judge Ray Grunter from St. Louis. I said, I got reversed, but all I was doing was citing your opinion that you had read. It was your idea, you know, and I'm compelled to follow it, and then I get reversed, and it's on my record. So anyway, we had to, you know, I have a record. I have no idea. I've never kept score on those things, but the cases, hopefully got them right, but I don't keep track of those.
Well, we're at the end, and I'll simply give you the last word.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you for doing this. I know, you know, being the head work of the Historical Society, you've done this for years, and I thank you for that. It's a great opportunity to kind of document the history of our circuit, and you've got a lot of judges on there. No, I have nothing to add other than I should mention just a few people. As you well know, Millie Adams is our circuit executive, and she made my job as chief judge or as a circuit judge immensely more enjoyable, but certainly easier. She's a remarkable woman with a lot of knowledge and talent, and her staff.
And diplomacy.
And diplomacy. She could just about talk you into anything, the whole time laughing and smiling, and before you know it, you've agreed to do something that you didn't want to do. And of course, Michael Gans, our court clerk, who certainly is recognized as one of the top in the country, and if not the top court clerk. And as chief judge, I worked with him a lot, and he's just a marvelous person, both in his job but as an individual. And of course, all my law clerks and my judicial assistant, who I still call as a secretary because that's what she was when I was a lawyer, Chris Schneis, and we're going to hang it up at the same time, and as I said, we're going to get on our horses and ride off into the sunset. But it has been most enjoyable. Even though I thought you should have had the job, I'm glad I got it.
No, as I said at the time of your swearing in, the president made the right choice for obvious and subtle reasons. And I am honestly glad he did. You've done Nebraska and yourself proud, and I am sincerely proud of having the privilege of knowing you these last long years.
Yeah.
So I think we'll wind up and let the court reporter and the videographer rest.
Okay.
We're off the
Thank you again, and thank both of you, and thank you for your stamina.